Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I thought we'd have a little bit of fun. And what has triggered this is that earlier in this week, Rishi Sunak delivered his speech which contained 5 pledges. Now up to this point, Rishi Sunak has been a surprisingly quiet Prime Minister in British politics. You would have thought that, with the country having so many problems, particularly economic problems and health problems and so on and so forth, you would imagine any Prime Minister would want to be on the airwaves a lot, want to be saying a lot to reassure the public, to detail plans and so on and so forth. Rishi Sunak had been oddly quiet throughout this period. And now I think I'm starting to understand why. Because whenever he does deliver speeches, they don't go down very well. Surprisingly, for a man who made a lot of money by supposedly being intelligent, he seems to be lacking certain abilities when it comes to being a political leader. So in short, his 5 pledges were pretty awful and had garnered widespread criticism, and not just from the left side of British politics either, I don't think. I think the right side as well has not been too impressed with his performance. So as a consequence of that, I've seen a lot of commentary from people saying, oh God, we've got to put up with this for another 2 years. Well, not necessarily. There are a few things, there's all sorts of things in fact, that could happen. That would mean that you wouldn't have to wait for Rishi Sunak to call a general election for 2 years. But I'm just going to focus on one option at this point. And that one option is Keir Starmer. As leader of the Labour Party, he has more options than most. So in this video, let's put some assumptions down. Let's imagine that you're Keir Starmer. And let's imagine that Keir Starmer makes the decision that Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party are a huge threat to the UK, economically, health, civil society, whatever you want to attach to it. Let's just say he makes the determination that the country cannot afford to wait 2 years for a general election and to put up with bad decision making in that meantime. So if you're Keir Starmer, you then ask the question, well, what can you do? What options are available to him in order to accelerate the timeline to get a general election called sooner? So let us further imagine that he has a special advisor. And let's call that special advisor Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, he was a very famous negotiator back in the day. He advised various Italian princes and kings of things that they could do. He came up with some quite interesting negotiation strategies, in fact, to help them further their power and deal with the opposition and so on. So let us imagine the scenario that good old Niccolo is a special advisor to Keir Starmer and is asked to think of some strategies to help create a general election this year. Well, I've thought of 3 different options here. So let's pretend to be Niccolo. Let's go through those options and let's have a bit of fun. Now, before I do that, let's start with a question. It's a very normal question for me. What is a negotiation? As a professional negotiator that teaches people how to negotiate, I ask this question quite often. So anyone who's been paying attention on this channel will know that the answer to that question is firstly that a negotiation is a means of achieving an objective or making a decision. That is what you do in a negotiation. You figure out what it is you want, what it is you want to achieve, and you negotiate to ensure that that objective is met or that you're given sufficient information to make a decision. Which is the second part of the answer to this question, is that a negotiation is a means by which you obtain information in order to help you achieve that objective or to make a decision. So, in other words, a negotiation is a form of due diligence. That is what I say often on this channel. However, there's a little bit, something additional worth pointing. It's not always true, which is why I don't put this as part of the answer, but it's worth highlighting here. And that is, a negotiation is also a means by which you can force a change. Now, in a standard context, you would force a change by being in a meeting room with the other side and negotiating for them to do things or to make certain decisions, to change what it is they're going to do, to put money in, whatever that might be. That is a conventional way of thinking of negotiation. But what you also have to remember is that negotiation is communication. And communication can take a wide range of forms. Now, you've got the obvious stuff. You can write things down, you can say them, you can communicate orally. However, there are some more unconventional ways of communication. I mean, you can sneak up to someone with a baseball bat and smash them over the head. That is not a very good form of communication or negotiation, but it is in itself a form of communication. So when it comes to negotiation, you can force change by communicating in different, perhaps more underhand ways. And in politics, it is all about underhand, really, and how you can communicate your message and communicate in a way that promotes yourself whilst undermining the opposition. So it's a different way of communicating and negotiating. But I wanted to put this out there because I wanted people to understand that Starmer can negotiate his way into power. He's going to have to negotiate his way into power. And there's a wide range of means, conventional and unconventional, open to him to do so. This specific video is going to focus on a narrow topic, which is quite unconventional. Actually, not that unconventional, actually. But with the specific goal of forcing an early general election. So, as a first option, let's start with a very popular means of forcing change, particularly on the left wing and occasionally on the right wing side of political movements. And that, of course, is to create revolutions. And there's plenty of historical precedent for this. You can look at Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Gaddafi, and a whole host of others all around the world have been dissatisfied with the government, with the political party in charge, and basically created a revolution in which to topple the government and replace them with their own people. Now, of course, many of those revolutions were quite violent, and needless to say, this is not what I am advocating in this video. But of course, you can also get quite non-violent revolutions, and there's plenty of precedent for that as well. So some of the traditional things that tends to happen when sort of creating a revolutionary movement to topple a government, including democratic governments, is you would have strikes, particularly widespread strikes and industrial action. It's particularly the case when a revolution is originating from the working class and they withdraw their labour in protest at what the ruling political party is doing. You can also create a wide range of different civil disobedience. So refusing to cooperate with government authorities, refusing to pay taxes, going out to the street and protesting, blocking the streets, and so on. And of course, this is all about the numbers. If you've got enough numbers, then usually you can force a change from the government, especially democratic government. Of course, autocratic governments who don't care about democracy or human rights can just send out the police and military and gun the protesters down. But fortunately, the UK is a democracy, even a very flawed one, and generally even the Conservatives don't tend to do that. So in this sort of scenario, what could be happening is that Keir Starmer could be encouraging a wide range of people in UK society to protest against the government. And some of that could be peaceful, normal, send letters to MPs, drown them in protest letters, go out on the streets, hold up placards, even if the Conservatives have tried to make that more difficult, go on strikes, support the unions, basically create a lot of noise. Now, of course, if we were in France, I wouldn't have to explain any of this. The French understand this revolutionary concept, and very well, plenty of that in their history. And in fact, if the French had a government this bad, they would already be down at the Élysée Palace with their burning torches and rolling out Madame Guillotine for a good old bit of fashion, good old-fashioned bit of revolutionary chopping. But we're not in France. We're British. British don't do that sort of thing. The Brits sit at home, read their newspapers, drink their tea, tut reprovingly and say how terrible or how awful. They don't go out on the street and vent very much. They leave that to the more sort of emotionally excitable types of people. So needless to say, fomenting a bit of revolution in the UK against the Conservative Party is going to be a little bit tricky. And I think it's safe to say that's not really Starmer's style. He's not the sort of person to do this. Not least because one of the key things is not only general dissatisfaction with the government, but also you need a popular, charismatic leader to drum up the emotions, to excite the crowd. And then we come to Keir Starmer. Oh dear. Possibly not possessing the charisma required for this option, shall we say. But then, to be honest, he doesn't need to, because the Conservative Party are doing this far better than he can. At the rate that the Conservative Party are going, they are creating quite a significant amount of dislike, unrest, and general distaste for themselves and their policies. So it is quite possible that Starmer has taken the view he doesn't need to do any of this, which is a very risky strategy, perhaps, in his view, because the Conservative Party are doing it for him, so why interrupt them in their good work? So now we come to the second option, which is much more up Starmer's street and pretty much more conventional in terms of Westminster politics. And that is that he steals and co-opts Conservative MPs. Now, there are two main ways that he could do this. One is, the obvious one, is defections. He should aim to try and get as many Conservative MPs as possible to defect to the Labour or even the Liberal Democrats. Or, I suppose the SNP, maybe, unlikely. So, or even Reform UK, perhaps. Because by doing that, he would chip away at the authority of Rishi Sunak, as the leader of the Conservative Party. Now, this is an interesting option, because if you were a Conservative MP, particularly in the so-called Red Wall seats, then unless you're completely brain dead, and I fully accept that there are many Conservative MPs who are not the sharpest tool in the box, but even they must be able to recognise that their seats are not exactly safe, and that those seats are quite likely to switch to Labour in the coming general election. Now, if they fancy staying as an MP, then the solution is actually quite simple. They defect to Labour. They join Starmer, and in exchange, Starmer agrees that they will keep their seat and stand for re-election as a Labour candidate at the general election. So if he does that, then obviously he could start bit by bit take away that majority that Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party has. To do that, he would need to create about 35 defections. The Conservative Party have about a majority of 70, so every seat lost that goes to the other side is the equivalent of 2 seats lost, really. Now, it has to be said that the odds of any political leader being able to persuade 35 Tory MPs to defect is pretty unprecedented and remote. However, he doesn't need that many. Because if Starmer is able to persuade, let's pick a number between 5 and 10, that alone would massively undermine the Conservative Party, massively shake them, and probably cause them to fall apart. And Starmer could be a bit mischievous here, because he could take a bit of a leaf out of the Conservative Party book, in that he could go to those Conservative MPs, particularly the Red Wall ones, and encourage them to defect, or even just to resign and trigger by-elections that Labour could then fight and hopefully win. And in exchange, he could do what the Conservatives do. He could offer to those MPs to make them peers when he becomes Prime Minister. I mean, certainly the Conservative Prime Ministers of past have done that plentifully, so what's good for them could be good for Starmer. And of course for him this would actually be quite a cheap promise, because he planned to abolish the House of Lords anyway, so they'd only be in for a few years before the reforms, whatever they may look like in the future, would then come in and kick them out anyway. So he could indeed foment a bit of trouble in the Conservative Party if he adopted this strategy. There is, however, a second way that he could achieve similar results, which is rather than by creating defections, create dissent. Now, it's not exactly much of a secret that there are various factions within the Conservative Party, and they're increasingly struggling to be civil to each other. So, of course, that creates weaknesses, and weaknesses can be exploited by a suitably ruthless leader. So what Starmer could aim to do is to start to target those factions that, even if they won't defect and join Labour, they might at least quit the Conservative Party, perhaps form an independent bloc and start voting against Rishi Sunak. And if he gets sufficient numbers to do that, that again would massively and fatally undermine Sunak's authority and the ability of the Conservative Party to function in the Westminster Parliament. Now, he doesn't just have to persuade them to do this, he could slightly force the scenario. And the way he can do that, an example I will use, is when Ed Miliband submitted that motion on fracking when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. For those who may recall, that created an almighty ruckus within the Conservative Party. It was a very clever strategy by Miliband, because it directly targeted a weakness in the Conservative Party that they could not be seen to be supporting fracking. And Liz Truss, unfortunately for her anyway, again very much not the sharpest tool in the box, fell for that particular strategy and ended up creating a massive split within the Conservative Party, which of course led to her rather immediate downfall. Now, I've noticed Labour are doing bits of this. They are submitting motions deliberately targeting various areas of weakness for the Conservative Party. And if they're able to get these motions to stick, to really fracture those Conservative factions from each other, then that would be a means by which he would chip away at the Conservative majority, and a Conservative Prime Minister that does not command a majority in the House of Parliament is one who is in danger of having a general election forced upon him. So by one means or another, what Starmer would need to do is find a way of getting 35 or so, more obviously ideally, but 35 or so Conservative MPs to no longer support Rishi Sunak or the Conservative Party. And if he could do that, that is a means by which he can force an early general election. And this is not as far-fetched an idea as it might have seemed in the past, because right now the Conservative Party is very much divided. They absolutely despise each other, and there may well be some Conservative MPs who would agree with the view that the current Conservative leadership is a threat to the country and need to go. And certainly there are plenty of former Conservative leaders and MPs who are openly saying just that right now. So this is a means for Starmer to target those weaknesses. And now we come to the third option. And our favourite negotiator, Niccolo Machiavelli, was not above advising that the leaders should send assassins to go and stick a knife in the back of the opposite leader. And he has some very interesting strategies and suggestions as the best means of doing so and when to do so. This is not exactly the strategy I am proposing here when I say that Starmer should have a strategy of targeted assassinations. Rather, and no violence involved, might I add, what is an open secret in Westminster is that there are an awful lot of MPs who should not be there. And there's two categories of MPs, shall we say. One is those who have just committed criminal offences. Fraud, driving offences, not quite as far as murder, but a whole host of other unsavoury things, often involving money, that really should disqualify them from continuing to be MPs. The reason why they're still there is because they've been shielded by the Conservative Party, or by the machinery of Westminster, I should say, not just the Conservative Party, and also because no criminal prosecution charges have been brought against them as of yet. I'm not going to name any names, quite apart from the fact I'd probably get it wrong and most definitely would get sued if I did so. I would only say it is an open secret that there are a number. And it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that a significant number of those are likely to be Conservative MPs. There's also a second category of MP that should not be in Westminster, and these are the ones that are on the notorious sex pest list. Not all of them Conservative, but again, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that there are a significant number of Conservative MPs on that list. And what this list is, it's a list given to all women MPs in Westminster of people to avoid at all costs. Don't have drinks on these men, don't get in a lift with them, they are dangerous sexual predators. Now again, this is an open secret and I'm not going to name any names. But what that does mean is that all these individuals really should be drummed out of Parliament. I mean, take any normal employer or organisation in the UK, that is exactly what would happen. They would be kicked out extremely quickly. Westminster is a very odd place that tries not to do that sort of thing. It hasn't quite caught up with the 21st century, obviously. Now, Keir Starmer is well aware of this problem. He may not wish to talk about it, but he is well aware of it. And we have seen this in that he has adopted a strategy of quietly getting rid of the Labour MPs who fall into those two categories. And this has triggered a couple of by-elections recently that Labour have won or retained the seats on, and they got rid of those MPs. Now, arguably, many people are pointing out that Starmer is also adopting similar strategy when it comes to far left-wing MPs in his party, but that's a different political conversation. So what I'm saying here by a strategy of targeted assassination against Conservative MPs is that he finds ways of drumming them out. To take the likes of Owen Paterson, he could deliberately adopt a strategy of exposing their corruption, their fraud, or whatever it may be, and get the court of public opinion to put pressure on Rishi Sunak to fire them or for them to resign and trigger a by-election. Alternatively, Starmer could then submit a whole host, not directly, he could do it indirectly, a whole host of formal complaints to the Parliamentary Privileges and Standards Committees and get all those MPs investigated and sanctions applied on them. And of course, any MPs that is suspended from Parliament for more than 10 working days as a consequence of those sorts of sanctions automatically triggers the recall petition. so they become in danger of losing their seat and triggering a by-election. So if you take option 2 and option 3, you might imagine that it's quite possible that Starmer could get rid of 35 Conservative MPs, perhaps even trigger a whole host of by-elections and flip those seats towards Labour. And it is possible that we will get early visibility of this if the committee places sanctions upon Boris Johnson for lying to Parliament when he was Prime Minister. This may also trigger, by the way, another one of those most disruptions within the Conservative Party, similar to that fracking motion. The Conservative MPs are going to have to vote on whether to suspend Boris Johnson. So that is going to be very exciting. But my point is that Starmer could try and roll out that strategy even wider and go against a whole number of Conservative MPs who are equally, if perhaps not more deserving of being sanctioned than even Boris Johnson is. And if he does it enough, he could chip away at that majority and thus force a general election. So my final remarks for this video. Let's start with the fact that 2023 is going to be a very bad year for the Conservative Party. They look decisive. The economy is going into a very significant recession. They're a bit of a spent force after 12 or 13 years in power. The looming health crisis is going to be very politically damaging. So in short, this would be an absolutely terrible idea, or terrible year I should say, for Rishi Sunak to trigger a general election. So needless to say, he is not likely to do so voluntarily. He will obviously keep things going for as long as possible, for the maximum 2 years that are available to him. So by that token, this then means that this would be a great year for the Labour Party to trigger a general election. Now Starmer may be making the calculation that Labour could be in just as good, if not even in a better position in 2 years' time. But 2 years is a very long time in politics. And so I imagine if our lovely little Machiavellian special advisor might be just whispering in his ear, let's see if we can't force things a little bit sooner. Because, let's be honest, in 2 years' time the Conservatives might be able to claw back some of those poll numbers. Whereas it is very certain that, judging by the polls, they would lose a huge number of seats. And if Starmer really wants to be able to do the things he wants to do and not have to worry about the left wing of his party, having an extremely large majority would be somewhat conducive to that aim. So I imagine he would be somewhat rather interested in triggering a general election. The thing is, will he make the decision, will he pursue a strategy to do so? And I think we're seeing some early signs of this. This mainly can be seen in Prime Minister's Question Time, when he is not only criticising Rishi Sunak and his decision directly, and he did the Liz Truss and Boris Johnson as well, but he has also made direct appeals and criticism towards the Conservative MPs on the benches opposite. And of course, Ed Miliband was very successful in his motion, and no doubt Starmer and the Labour Party will be looking to replicate that success in the future. So there's a whole host of means by which Starmer can chip away at the legitimacy of the Conservative Party. He can make them doubt themselves. And if a significant number of those MPs start to really doubt themselves, then discipline is going to break down. And that can manifest itself in various ways. And there's various things that can happen. Because the reality is that the UK government, headed up by the Conservative Party, is under multiple pressures from multiple points. It's truly astonishing the level of failures that happen. It's called a cascade effect, when literally, because you failed to fix things early on, other failures pile onto the earlier failures, and then it starts to have a runaway effect. This is what is happening to UK government and the Conservative Party right now. All those chickens are coming home to roost. Those multiple failures are coming back. And what this does, it creates multiple areas of weakness or multiple angles of attack for Starmer. And no doubt he will be seeking to exploit those. Whether he does so just to score political points or to actually create some form of change is up to him. So the final point that I will add to that is that, as I've always said before, democracy is basically a bloodless battle. It's a means by which two opposing sides can fight without having to bring up armies and kill people. That is not to say that democracy is not in itself occasionally a bit bloody. All is fair in love and war. And truth be told, when it comes to democracy, it doesn't really favour those who play nicely. It favours those who do have that ruthless streak, who are willing to be unscrupulous in order to engineer odds better in their favour. No army goes into a battle willingly, levelling the playing field for the other side. They will stilt things in their favour as much as possible, whether that's in the timing, choice of equipment, use of the weather, use of the terrain, or whatever. Politics and democracy is no different to those principles. And so in this sort of scenario, it is not inconceivable that the strategy of creating attrition within the Conservative Party ranks could be seen as a means of furthering democratic aims. So on that cheerful, happy note, I hope you found this interesting. And this is perhaps one of the final lessons to give just as a negotiation concept. There is always a way of doing something, even if the situation looks hopeless. And the reason why that way isn't pursued could be because the cost could be too high, or because you don't really want to put that much effort or money or whatever into doing it, or perhaps because you have a moral objection to doing it. Those are the reasons why those options are not pursued in parallel to any negotiation. Politicians and morality can be strangers to one another. So in that context, I would not at all be surprised if Starmer did perhaps use a few underhand tricks, and we certainly already know that the Conservative Party are using a wide variety of underhand tricks as a form of damage limitation, although they are struggling to make those effective in the current climate. So I hope you found this video interesting and helpful, and I look forward to seeing it in the comments box below.